So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, the recently signed OBBB, or One Big Beautiful Bill, is now law. And that law basically eliminates the 30% tax credit for residential solar. It also adds restrictions for the 30% tax credit for commercial solar. And the commercial solar structure is used for residential leases and power purchase agreements, or PPAs. So there still may be some financing available for homes, but it's going to be done through a commercial structure, and that's going to apply to the new rules for that commercial tax credit. So effectively, from a cash standpoint and a loan standpoint, if you go to a bank or if you go to a credit union, the costs for solar will go up by 30%. Starting January 1st, 2026. Solar leasing is more complicated, but I expect that because of all these extra complexities, the cost of leasing and PPAs is going to go up. But I think there's still going to be opportunities for those financial structures, at least the companies that are specializing in it do. Now, in addition to what was in the OBBB, there are domestic content rules, safe harbor considerations, foreign entity of concern issues, or FEOC issues, that are still kind of being worked out by the Treasury Department and the Trump administration. So I can count on the fact that there's going to be more changes to the commercial financing opportunities for solar. Now, what's happening now that this bill passed, and even in advance of the bill passing, people were expecting it, every solar contractor is working like crazy to get systems fully installed by the end of the year. And I think 2025 is going to be a record year for solar and battery installations for residential homes. But what's happening, in addition to the big end-of-year rush, is smart companies are planning now for their business in 2026. And that raises two big questions. First, what should solar contractors and installers be doing to succeed in 2026 and beyond? And attached to that is, what should solar and battery consumers, customers consider when evaluating products and installers? So, if you've got a really good pitch for homeowners, you have a better chance of doing well in 2026 and beyond. Now, this week's guest is Corey Geiger. He's the Chief Operating Officer at Enstall. And Enstall is the biggest rooftop racking company in the world. I've been working with them basically since the beginning, forever. Now, they're a roll-up. They're a combination of IronRidge, EcoFasten, Quickmount, and PanelClaw. And just because of the quality, it's not because of the price, but it's because of the quality, we use IronRidge exclusively for our residential and our commercial projects. Now, prior to his solar racking career at Enstall, Corey was at a company called Sparq Systems, which I remember. They were based in Canada.
That's right.
And I remember meeting the CEO at one of the SPI meetings and said, gee, that's a really cool product, but the name kind of scares me. But, so Sparq Systems, and they competed with Enphase and SolarBridge and a few others. Enphase really came out on top. And then he spent a lot of time at Soligent, which is a really, really good distributor, which was a roll-up between DC Power and Sunwise. Really, really good companies. So Corey has experience both from an operational standpoint on mounting systems. He's been in the inverter business. He's been in the distribution business. So I'm really looking forward to his advice on how he can help solar companies thrive even without the tax credit. So here we are. Welcome to the show, Corey.
Well, thanks very much, Barry. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. It's just great to have you here in our scenic Los Gatos studio. We've been installing with IronRidge for so long, but it'd be good to let our listeners know. Tell us a little bit about Enstall, about the roll-up, and about the companies that are part of your group.
So the Enstall family of companies actually has a big footprint both in the United States and in Western Europe. Originally, Enstall was started by a private equity firm called Rivian Capital in the Netherlands. And after picking up its first solar company in the Netherlands, they decided to expand over in the United States. They just saw an opportunity to really latch onto two markets that had a lot of growth at the time. So in 2018, Rivian picked up EcoFasten Solar and then picked up IronRidge and Quickmount in rapid succession. And then about a year later, picked up, I guess it was 2 years later, picked up PanelClaw at that point. In total, Rivian, under the Enstall banner, has been able to pick up 9 companies, 5 of them in Europe, 4 of them here in the United States. We continue to look for opportunities to continue to build synergies on what we've already got in terms of a footprint, buying power, economies of scale, that sort of thing. But we've been at it since essentially 2018, and here we are almost 7 years later and still going strong.
You know, in the solar industry, the sexy things first were solar panels, then inverters, now batteries. Don't take this the wrong way, but racking isn't necessarily really that sexy. But it's an essential part of every single. And I know you may disagree with me, and I hope I'm not offending you. But it's just an essential part, and it's got to work for the lifetime of the system. And we've found that once you pick the right racking system and get really good at it, it really, really can make the business going better. So I like the history. I worked with all those companies at one point or another, and it's just great, the standards. And it's complicated. I mean, it's not like you got electronics, but you got supply chain nightmares and aluminum smelting and production and extruding and shipping. It's super, super complicated. So I'm really glad you're here, and I'm really glad that you can give us your insights in answering these 2 questions that I have and a lot of other people in the industry have is, what should solar contractors and installers be doing now so they succeed in 2026 and beyond? And what are solar and battery consumers, homeowners, customers considering when evaluating products and installers? So just let us know, stream of consciousness, what your advice is.
Sure. Wow. I guess the first warning is advice is worth what you pay for it. So I think what I can share today is maybe the distillation of a lot of conversations we've had with our distribution partners, with developers on the C&I side, with third-party ownership firms on the residential side, and quite a few large installers and small installers. IronRidge in any given quarter services about 3,500 installers itself through its distribution partners. So we do have a really broad population that we get to talk to.
That's exactly why I'm delighted that you're here, because you speak to a lot of people at levels and in details that nobody else does, and you can kind of distill that advice. Let's just work on the first question. What should solar contractors do?
Yeah, I think so. Again, I think what I'll do is I'll recap a couple of themes that I'm hearing when you talk to installers who are sort of leaning into this. And this is the really interesting thing, because I think we've all been very excited riding the wave of the IRA and some of the additional demand that's brought on and some of the additional creativity up and down the value chain over the last couple of years. And now what we're seeing is some installers are really leaning into the challenge that I'm going to call it the O3B, because I'll always use too many Bs otherwise. But the O3B is really bringing a new set of challenges. And the installers who are sort of leaning into this and really trying to do 2 things at once at the moment. One is make sure they get to PTO with lots of residential jobs before the end of this year, and at the same time think about how they need to be structured, what their practices are, pivots they might need to make, tools they might need to adopt as we get into 2026. I think it's a very, very busy time. Lots of bodies on rooftops, lots of full heads trying to figure out how we're going to get all of this done. But there are a couple of key themes. The first is, you said earlier, I think in the lead up, that we effectively have a 30% tax increase. It's actually worse than that, because if you're looking at it from a net of the ITC right now for a residential job, it's actually about a 42% cost increase. And so if you're an installer, you're basically going to have to find at least 45% of your cost structure to repurpose if the price doesn't go up. But the good news is the price is going to go up. And the reason is because I think we were looking at a stat earlier, Barry. I think PG&E's raised their rates over 40% in the last 3 years alone, and over 100% in the last 10 years. They're not the only utility doing this. They just happen to be the utility that we all know and love here in Northern California.
Well, I wouldn't use the word love, although Patty Poppy has expressed that to all of her customers at one point.
Yeah, well, I think they're a product of the rules set, and I think that's the thing that we all need to recognize at this point. Even though the ink isn't totally dry on guidance, thanks to the executive order of July 7th, we're all still waiting for some additional rules to be drafted. We do have a new set of rules, and that means that we now need to play a different game. Going back, you're looking for quite a bit of cost reduction, but you're also looking for a way to change the value proposition that you're bringing to the market. And as residents, as homeowners, continue to watch their power bill go up every 6 months, more and more of them are going to, over the next few years, realize that it's still worth getting solar. It is still worth doing the whole home electrification math to see how much of that they can do over time. Heat pumps, a big thing I know that we're both fans of. I think there's just a whole lot there, and just how it gets sold, how it gets installed, what the projects look like, that's what's going to have to transform. But you're going to, as an installer, if you can get your strategy right, if you can modify your value proposition, you're going to be able to charge more. And at the same time, you're going to have to figure out how to cut cost so you can continue to grow a healthy business.
Yeah, and so it's actually 3 dimensions, and I was only thinking about 2, but the 3 dimensions are, first, we can sell at a higher price, and that's because the economics have gotten better because the electricity is more. And then the other thing is, and you're on the supply side, you may have some insights into this, is everybody's going to have to sharpen their pencil. And especially, I'm not really sure about how things work on the aluminum racking side and the component side, but I just know that the module companies are going to lower their pricing because they have the production, and the battery costs are going to continue to go down. So the total costs are going to go down, and companies are all going to have to, some of them are going to have to take a smaller margin. Although you got to be careful because there's a lot of them, especially some of the medium and the big ones and small ones too. They're running at a negative margin. They're not profitable.
Well, and that's not sustainable, right? You've got to be able to figure out how to pivot out of that, and it's going to require a bit of a reset. I do think, though, that as we go through the months of next year, we're going to see new modes of financing come up because, all of a sudden, if you don't have a tax credit to help you build the ROI on your financing, you're going to restructure that financing, right? And interest rates are probably going to stay higher than traditional here for another period of time.
Well, at least until 2026.
I think,
they try and get rid of the chairman of the Fed.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a while. And as a result, I think you are going to see some real financial innovation because remember this, we've had a lot of companies, thanks to some of the additional tax credits and structures that came out with the IRA, we've actually got quite a few people who safe harbored pipelines, basically. Mm-hmm. And they safe harbored them. They were able, safe harboring effectively, to keep it simple, it allows you to grandfather a set of tax credits. And it gives you about 4 years after you've done your safe harbor paperwork to roll those systems out. So there will be a part of the business that is now going to be in pure selling and execution mode for the next, let's call it 4 years. And then there's another part of the business, especially the part for people who do not want a lease or a PPA. That business is the business that really has to innovate in the very near term because that's the part of the business that's going to be the most impacted by this effective cost increase.
So let's talk about that innovation. A lot of companies, as small companies, even companies like ours, we don't have teams of innovators, engineers that can figure out how to do things better. We're buying things off the shelf. Mm-hmm. So let's look at the shelf that all of the mounting systems are on. What are some of the things that IronRidge is doing to reduce installation costs, reduce costs, so that we can kind of get closer to the higher profitability level?
Well, part of this is, and we've been working on it for years. I think you've seen a lot of improvement. For those of us who've been in solar long enough to remember ZEP, ZEP really changed the game in residential racking. Not because ZEP was railless, but because ZEP actually took a totally different look at the roof.
I just have to say, don't forget about the Enstall product, which was a knockoff of ZEP.
Yeah,
ZEP knocked off.
I remember the Enstall product. And you had several folks come in. I mean, Spice was very similar.
Spice was after,
You were really looking for a way to innovate the way you approach the roof. And, part of this was just taking the erector set, a sort of nature of what residential racking was 20 years ago, and turning it into something that is a lot more kitted, a lot less error prone, a lot more reliable in terms of the installation, but first and foremost, fastest.
So a little bit of history with the Enstall system. And when I first started doing solar installations, it was 2001. And I couldn't buy solar modules from BP Solar or Astra Power. Everybody was sold out. But Kyocera was, they said, hey, we're kind of new in the U.S. We've got modules. And I was one of their biggest installers in Silicon Valley. They started working with Sharp too. And I was installing these, and I'm doing it myself. I'm installing these modules. I say, hey, there's aluminum frames on these modules. And I'm carrying up aluminum racking from Unirack at the time. And I had the idea of saying, why don't we make the frame of the module with the same or a similar profile to the racking? And I brought that to Kyoto, and I met with the Japanese engineers at Kyocera. And this is just like burned in my mind, I think in like circa 2002. I showed them how this would work, and I had little mock-ups. I said, isn't this better? And they were very polite. They actually bowed, and they said, yes, that's a really good idea. But then we have to raise the price a little bit more because there's more aluminum. And I'm like, yeah, but I got to buy this huge racking. And so I got twice as much aluminum in the racking than you do on your frame, but they just decline. And that mentality from manufacturers continued to kind of go through. Yes, there was some time savings, but it was really hard to convince the manufacturers to do something different. And that kind of is the case right now too. It's not that we're trying to get them to make 100 kilowatts of modules or 5 megawatts of modules. They're doing gigawatts. And they want to make sure that they can sell gigawatts at a time so that they can make them for 12 cents a watt. And if you just can't change that mentality, it's really, really hard.
Yes, I would agree with you, but I also think we've got lots and lots of abandoned systems for one set of reasons or another, because somewhere along the value chain, people were cutting corners to get that cost low. Mm-hmm. That's also not a sustainable practice for our industry, right? Yep. So I think it's really important to work with suppliers and innovate in ways that are going to make sure that the system is still durable, the system is still safe, but the system also can go in pretty quickly.
Yeah, speed is important, and finding manufacturers that are established. I mean, I can't tell you how many module companies that come by, and inverter companies, and microinverter battery companies. I get several emails, sometimes a day, of new battery companies. It kind of trickled off a little bit, but you want to make sure that the manufacturer is established. It's got a balance sheet.
Well, and here's the interesting thing, being a racking guy, and as you said, I started in distribution, so it really gave me an opportunity to see the value chain kind of, top to bottom. One of the things that I noticed is over time, installers tend not to have that much of a loyalty to a solar panel. When I first got into the business, I don't think I want to say how many years ago it was, but it was a long time ago. I got into the business and, at the time people were quite enamored with panels because the cost was really coming down fast and the technological innovation was really coming at a quick clip. But now that's a little bit less so with certain installers. They'll move panels from, fairly regularly. Inverters maybe, less so. They have I think more of a loyalty cycle. But the thing that's really interesting is that installers do not like to change their racking. And the reason they don't like to change their racking is because once you get the muscle memory of how you're taping things out or chalking things out on the roof and how you're setting up your pilot holes and how you're setting up your arrays and then how you're dropping that material onto the roof so you can lay down the panels and get everything properly connected, the racking part is the place where you can lose the most time on the roof if it's a system that you don't like working with.
I've got, 8 or 10 pickups, and they have bins on the sides, and the bins on the sides are all filled up with, this flash foot and this bolt and this. They're all for IronRidge components. And, we replenish them automatically, but the guys are all used to it. They go there blindfolded and grab a bunch of end clamps, whatever. So that makes a very, very big difference. The other place where there's a lot of loyalty is on the battery side because it's just so complicated to install. But with the solar modules, if a really big company has really good reputation and has a really good price and it's available through distribution, we'll make a 6 to 12 month commitment. And, we kind of evolve through that because companies come into the market and they have really good products.
That's right. Yeah. And I know you've commented on this in other podcasts, but it's in the battery storage space is really where the leapfrogging is going on. And it's, as I think some of your other guests have talked about in the past, there's a sort of an evolution of looking at it as not really a battery, but a way to actually provide a power solution for a home that provides more continuity and reliability. And that means you're asking a whole lot out of software. And that creates a connection with the homeowner in this case, but it also, as you were remarking, think about an installer who, the electrical part, you want to talk about the stakes being high. If you get that wrong, you're clearly going to want to go with something that is easy and reliable to install, but also is not something that's going to take a lot of maintenance over time.
The thing that I've seen kill more battery system companies than anything is incomplete or inadequate or poorly designed software. Mm-hmm. The hardware's good, but when you try and integrate this battery and this inverter and this charge controller and this device for different companies, and if you don't have software that's seamless, you're going to really have a problem in the market. It happens again and again and again. And it's happening with some of the biggest companies. They say, well, we're just going to get into the battery business. It ain't going to happen. It's tough. It's a good reason why IronRidge doesn't have a lot of software, although we do regularly use your design software. And once you kind of get the hang of that design software, we're using it for ground mounts most of the time. It really, really helps.
Yep. When we see something very similar on the C&I side, where another one of our portfolio companies, PanelClaw, is a big market share participant, and they've invested massive amounts in their software to help with layouts and being able to flip those layouts, iterate on those layouts as different optimization requirements come as you're trying to pencil in PPAs and all that kind of stuff. You really need high-powered software to get that solution dialed in quickly.
And then you get the design good, you get it engineered, you get it permitted, the job's ready to start, but then there's a 6-month delay, and then that module is no longer available. You need another module. Having software that can quickly do those calculations for a different size module really, really helps.
That's right. And that ends up, passing back up into the supply chain as well in terms of the way you design the product, the way you manufacture it, the way you deliver that product, right? How you stock that product, how you might work with third parties downstream to manage the logistics of that product. All of that, you really want that to be a fine-tuned machine so that you can, take cost out, but also more important than that actually is making sure that the installer has their stuff on time, because especially, I'm sure Barry, sometimes you're bringing a lift truck up, or you're bringing a bucket, and you've been given an easement for 2 hours, and all that stuff's got to show up and get on that rooftop in a really narrow time window. So you've really got to dial this in. Right? Residential doesn't really run into this as much, but it is an area that really matters. And if you are going to be part of a value chain where you're really trying to take out cost, it's little things like that you've got to be able to dial in.
Yeah.
And that means you're collaborating up and down the value chain to make sure that all of these handoffs, we're not lobbing batons at each other, where we're making sure that we're passing them as we're both running, right? And we're making sure that we're always sitting down on a frequent basis, trying to make sure that we're doing as much as we can do to make our customers successful, and then asking our suppliers to do the same thing for us. And it needs to be sort of a continuous feedback, and it has to be two-way communication, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes the way I can help you best is something I've never thought of, but you've got to be in a position where you can come and tell me what I could be doing.
Well, tell us a little bit about what you have developed in terms of your supply chain and your logistics in order to keep up with what has become, unfortunately, a very dynamic supply chain situation in the U.S., first with COVID and now with tariffs. So where do you make your items, and how do they get to installers, whether in the small or medium or large?
Well, we actually have a no-kidding worldwide supply chain to just attend to the American market. And there are multiple reasons for that. During COVID, we learned a lot about geographic diversity and resilience, right? Figuring out how you could manage your lead times, right? And that sort of thing. But also with the IRA, with the domestic content bonus credit, where if you are a business and you're trying to take the tax credit, under certain conditions, if you have the right stuff being built in the United States, you can actually get a 10% adder on that ITC. So instead of 30%, now it's 40% off the job. That means you better have a supply chain that actually really builds stuff in the United States. So we have diversified 4 different products and platforms where we build things. And this is actually a rather tightly connected supply chain, because we need to make sure that we're not tying up a lot of our working capital on things that people don't want to buy, right? And at the same time, especially when you look at C&I jobs, right, you want to be able to respond to a window, a delivery time window that, there's a lot of hurry up and wait sometimes there. So you better have a logistics solution that's tailored to that particular project need or that type of project's need. But residential is very different. And we're actually structured as a company where the EcoFasten and PanelClaw businesses are direct to installer and sometimes direct to site shipping for projects. And at the same time, IronRidge works only through distribution. And the reason is because if you look at the large population of residential installers, we're talking about a lot of people who, to help defray their working capital requirements and to help them lower their costs, they rely on distribution to send them things on a weekly supply basis, maybe even ship to site for them. And that's not something that as a racking company you can necessarily scale well, especially when you're doing it with 3,500 installers.
You can't be in the weeds on that. It'll drive you crazy.
So the partnerships, going back to what I was saying earlier, the partnerships with distribution partners around the country are absolutely critical to making this work. And I think going forward, especially as working capital gets tighter, interest rates are not going to be coming down, right? So do you really want to take a loan out to fund operations of your business? Can you leverage the partnership of a good distributor who can provide a lot of those services.
Yeah, and that's one of the pieces of advice that I give to other installers is this is not the time to be taking on debt in order to hit higher revenue targets, because you're going to have to repay that debt, and it's going to be harder to repay that debt next year than it is right now. The biggest reason companies fail is that they run out of cash, but it's not until the bankruptcy attorney is there knocking on the door that you got to, lock places up. And you want to avoid that. Let's change gears a little bit. I know you guys don't do a lot of financing, but what are your thoughts about some of the financing options that are out there for residential customers, whether it's credit union loans and third-party ownership leases and PPAs?
So there's a well-established sort of portfolio of financing options. I think now with the expiration of the residential tax credit, I think that's going to create an interesting dynamic for a while until people figure out how they can lower their costs. Power prices in the meantime continue to go up, so we get back to that dynamic of we can charge a little bit more, but we still need to save some money in the way we do things. I think what we're going to see, especially, take another thought, we were talking about that 2-track thing going on with leases and PPAs where some things have been grandfathered, safe harbored, but now the tax credit that is applicable to leases and PPAs is expiring in 2027. So this gets really complicated really fast. But at the end of 2027, if you didn't do grandfathering before now, effectively you're going to be looking at a new way to run leases and PPAs after 2027. So I have a feeling we're going to see a lot of innovation in the third-party ownership TPO angle on things. I don't even know if calling them leases and PPAs is necessarily correct anymore once you start to see how people are going to innovate. Do you really need a 25-year PPA any longer, right? Will the financing mechanisms actually get simpler and more consumer-friendly because a PPA has a lot of paperwork and conditions tied to it, right? And that can be have a little bit of a chilling effect on homeowners who don't like complicated paperwork and feel a little intimidated and there's something going on with that, right?
Yeah. It's scary that some of the paperwork has so many terms in there that customers don't know at all.
One other thing while we're talking about this. I actually think solar is losing the tax credits, but storage is not. So if you're a financial wizard, and I am not, I'm a supply chain guy. If you're a financial wizard, you're probably coming up with a way to bundle solar and storage in a new package that allows the maximization of the tax credit for the battery while figuring out how to keep the cost burden of the solar side of it manageable within the entire financial package to the homeowner.
Yeah, that's something that's really coming up right now. I'm thinking about because 95% of our systems are solar with batteries, and 95% of those systems in the future, probably at the end of the year, have one big box with a battery and a solar and an inverter in it. So there's no more separate solar inverter. And we could arguably combine all the marketing, all the customer acquisition costs, all the sales costs, all the logistics costs, all of the costs related to our installations. We can allocate that to the battery system. And the only thing that's left is the costs for the labor, the racking, and the solar modules. And you have to kind of say, all right, there's no tax credit on that. It'll be interesting to see how those definitions evolve to make sure that, the people aren't really bending the rules too much.
And that's an area where the ink isn't quite dry yet.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of those things you just stay tuned, right?
Yep. All right. Well, let's kind of take a step back and put your customer hat on. You've got solar on your roof. This is your second system. Mm-hmm. What should customers think about when they're kind of looking at these options?
Well, I think the first thing is to understand what your goals are around electrification and how heating and powering is going to go on in your house over time, and what you think those needs are going to be. I'm not trying to overcomplicate it, but ultimately you don't want to undersize that solar array that you put on. You don't want to undersize that battery bank that you put on. You want to really think about this as a project that might take more than one step, right? So it's not just, we're not getting a bathroom remodel. We're actually thinking about how we're going to power our home, get some resiliency out of it, have room to grow, right? So I think it's important to sort of think through that a little bit. But you also might want to look at it, and I did this with one of my systems. I ended up using an installer that actually could do the roofing and the solar because I needed a new roof. So you don't want a roof that's going to, expire in 5 years, right? So if you're going to put on a system for 25. So you need to really think through a lot of these pieces first and then maybe talk to a few folks who can offer you some more of those services. I think you're going to see more of that sort of innovation with installers. Cinnamon Energy is doing a lot of this sort of thing. You're seeing your services activities really starting to grow. I think we're going to see some additional installers get into a space where they're adding more value than simply throwing a bunch of panels on a roof.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. I mean, we went from solar to solar and batteries to solar and batteries and EV chargers. And then, I kind of looked at this and said, hey, a heat pump's all electric too. We're also doing panel upgrades and service upgrades. So we painfully, over a 3-year period, got into the heat pump business, and it's harder than batteries, and batteries are harder than solar. But once you kind of get the hang of that, we can give a customer estimates and a proposal for basically everything, including incentives and how it would combine together and how much electricity they're going to be using when everything's running, and then kind of work with them to prioritize what they're going to do first and second. Obviously, what we'd like to do is get that solar and the battery on right away this year before the tax credit goes away. The tax credits for heat pumps, it's $2,000 or $3,000. It's not nothing, but it's not as significant as you've got with solar and batteries. And that's working really, really well. We've done some customers in Silicon Valley completely electrified their home, and they love it. And there's 4 trucks in front of the house for 2 or 3 days while all the work gets done. But then they got a zero bill.
Yep, and every 6 months the power price is going to go up. More and more people, it might not work out right now, but take a look at that once or twice a year and see what might work.
Yep. Now, with the decrease in the tax credit, 30% gone, effectively the longer paybacks, the more stress there is on installers. What is some of your thinking about how a customer should look at partners that are going to be there for a long time, to the degree to which they can do service and maintenance and cover the products that are on their roof?
One of the reasons there are so many systems that have been abandoned is because someone came in and slapped glass on the roof and disappeared. Literally, they're no longer in business. So a reputation for being in the business for a while, the ability to offer support and not just installation is going to be even more important as we go forward, because now the investment's going to feel bigger to a lot of people who are thinking through it, where it might have been cheaper before. I'm not sure that the homeowner is going to be able to look at it the same way for a bit, right? So this becomes a bit more of a serious investment and commitment by the homeowner. And I think most of them are going to need help trying to do that math, understanding what the impacts possibly could be, where the benefits are. I don't think a lot of homeowners think in terms of payback period. We all in solar think about payback periods, but affordability and managing that, and the reliability, the confidence in the outcome that is being proposed to them by the service provider. We'll call it an installer, but there's going to have to be a lot more sort of value in the offering, and then there's going to be a whole lot more support than I think maybe traditionally a lot of people who have thought about installing solar have thought was needed.
Yeah, and it's the reputation, it's being able to sell that value of, we've been doing this for a long time, we're part of the community. I think those companies are going to have a much better chance of surviving than brand new companies that come into solar. But I hope that a lot of other new companies do come in. There's going to be demand, it's just going to be different. But creating that value and a demand long term is really important. And I think about the staff we have here. The most expensive people we have on staff, besides the salespeople who just, get to keep what they kill, are the customer service technicians. The people that know how that old SMA inverter worked, the Fronius inverter worked, the Gen 2 Enphase worked on, how that old racking was attached and why this broke. Those are really hard people to find. They've been in solar for a long time, but they're absolutely gold. And when you have them and you got to charge a lot of money for service, which is kind of painful, but we do things the right way and we can help people, and we don't have to run away from that.
And I would encourage, adding on top of that, I would encourage any homeowner who's thinking about this to ask a lot of questions, because to your point, the company who is investing enough to actually answer those questions competently and are providing confidence early on and are not in a hurry to close, I think those folks are going to be the ones that can endure a lot of this change that we're going to be going through. They're going to be the ones that thrive, because if you make it about the customer and you're listening and you're providing that assurance, those are the surviving companies. And
in 2026, when there's no more tax credit and then people are trying to figure out, who's going to support my system, there's going to be a lot more demand for service. And when somebody has old solar panels or an old SMA inverter or something's not working, it's the service company that's going to install that new equipment. So you're not talking about a $500 service call. You're talking about a $10,000 or $20,000 opportunity when they want to replace things or they want to add a battery, and they're going to go to the ones that are established. So that's how you make money in service. You don't make money in service by charging for a fee to go out. That's break even at best. But the upgrades really start to make sense.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Yep.
What other advice do you have for people in the installation business, contractors, installers? Just at high level, and then we can kind of talk a lot about what some of the good news is.
It's really, first of all, I really empathize. Where all of us are going to have to learn that the cheese has moved, right? To use an old metaphor, but
the president pulled the football away again.
Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah, so we're all in a really messy predicament, and I think how we all navigate this is going to matter because solar's not going away. Solar is changing, but solar is not going away. And the folks who figure out how to add real value, sustainable value, are going to be the ones that are able to survive this. And that's going to require some creativity. That's going to require getting out of the comfort zone. And it's going to require some money. And I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all strategy for that. I think different people are going to do different things. Some are going to be lucky and are going to be able, through some sort of fusion or what have you, get into an adjacent line of business where solar becomes an adjunct to something else they're doing. Others might just simply roll up with other companies and try and create some sort of fusion of deal flow, right? So that they have enough contracts coming in where they've got good cash flow and managing their working capital well. I think you're going to have to be creative and flexible and open-minded.
Yeah. The way I look at it is you lose that 30%. But you've got electricity going up at 5 to 10% a year in California and elsewhere with AI and EVs and electrification. You've got expected equipment cost reductions. Labor is going to go up a little bit. You've got the ability to sell value more. I think the industry is going to be in about the same place in about 3 years. And we kind of went through the same thing here in California when the net metering changed. We all took a big hit, but then it's come back. Now, unfortunately, it just came back about the time that the tax credit's going away. Yeah. But solar panels are by far and away the cheapest way to generate electricity. And that's not going to change. And nuclear and geothermal and natural gas and whatever, even if you could get the equipment installed on a timely basis, which you can't, there's 10 years there to get pretty much any of that done. Solar is still going to be cheapest, and it's going to continue to get cheaper and cheaper. And batteries are right behind it on the same cost decline curve.
There are, I think, 2 case studies that illustrate your point that you just made. One is California, right? When we moved in M3, or never remember what they really call it. When they moved in M3, solar took a hit for a bit, but when it came back different. It did not come back the same, right? And it came back better, right? It was a more holistic solution. It was it had a much better addressable market, right? So I think we're in for something similar there. If you look at the way Texas has also innovated just through COVID alone and where they are now. Remember, Texas now is number 2 in battery storage at the utility scale. And this is a place where supposedly it's all about gas and oil. Remember how much wind they have. Remember how much solar they have. Remember how much storage they have. They're installing storage at a faster rate than California is. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no surprise.
To catch up, right? Yeah. But you look at these 2 models, there's a lot to learn from these recent transformations. There are lessons there. There are things, maybe pages to take out of those books that's still going to be applicable as we figure out how solar is going to come back different this time.
Yeah. And come back it will. There's no doubt in my mind. It's going to take a few years. Hopefully by then there'll be a more sympathetic administration, but we'll see. But regardless, the improvements in the economics for solar are going to just catch up to that tax credit, I'm sure, in 3 years. All right, take one step back. Let's talk about Corey a little bit. How did you get into the solar business?
So solar is my second career. My first career was in telecom infrastructure. I have always gravitated toward infrastructure, things that are, you're building things that are durable, you're building things that are improving quality of life, and you're also helping people be more self-sufficient. And got to enjoy the transition from analog to digital to IP and telecom, and decided to apply those skills in a different industry, and renewable energy was that place. I really like the notion of energy independence for our nation, but for our people as well. And that's what really attracted me.
So telecom infrastructure, electrical infrastructure, what kind of analogies do you see between the evolution from telecom, POTS infrastructure, pull to cellular, to what we have right now with the old-fashioned electrical grid that's been in place for over 100 years, and now you can kind of replace it with a battery and solar and put it on the building?
Yeah, well, sorry, this is a little nerdy, but being a networks guy back in the telecom time, the telecom network and the power network are opposite networks. The telecom network, for listeners, POTS means plain old telephone service. The telephone network was built with a completely symmetric, bidirectional capability. And the thing that upset the telecom network is when broadband came in. And now the bandwidth that goes to your house is so much more than the bandwidth you send back to the network, with the exception of the places that are developing that content. The power network is the opposite. The power network is unidirectional. And with the advent of distributed generation, you now need a more balanced bidirectional network. We're not investing in that fast enough. And that's where, if you will, that's sort of the keystone to making sure that energy independence for the country really happens. It's
affordable energy independence.
Affordable energy independence, well said. We don't just need to be investing in inexpensive sources of power. And I'm completely with you. Tax credit or not, solar electrons are still the cheapest and they're still the fastest to put on the grid. But we also need to make sure that that grid is capable of getting those electrons where they need to be. And that changes over the course of a day.
What I've seen happen when I kind of look at the costs for delivering those electrons is the farther away the generation source is. It doesn't matter if it's wind or geothermal or nuclear or whatever. It's more expensive the farther away it gets. And the closer to the building that's consuming the power, ideally on the roof, the less expensive that electricity delivery is.
It's actually a fact because of the losses.
Yep. And just because the way that the utilities own that network and are charged enormous costs for building that infrastructure, that electrical infrastructure.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. What do you do for fun?
I'm a cyclist. I love to ride. Yeah.
I'll give you an anecdote of my experience today cycling. So we don't have to talk about it on the radio because it's a little bit embarrassing. But what kind of bike do you ride?
Well, I somewhat sheepishly will admit that I have 4 bicycles. So I love to ride 4 bikes. I have a mountain bike. I have a cyclocross bike, which is now I think they call them gravel bikes. And then I have 2 road racing bikes.
I only have 3. So
there we go.
I have my original Trek from 1978, and I've got a Gary Fisher, and then I have a BMC that is now at the bike shop after my event this afternoon.
Oh, you've got a Gary Fisher. Wow.
It's a heavy. The Gary Fisher and the BMC are commuter bikes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, original Trek is a super lightweight bike of the time, which was still 30 pounds. But no, I just ride. I'll usually drive home, get my bike, and ride my bike back to the work, and that's my lunch. It's my workout. I don't go on long trips because my wife isn't a cyclist either. But that's kind of cool. Where do you ride?
Around here, it depends. When I have the gas, I go up the mountain and
Which mountain?
Kings Mountain. If you know, I would imagine it's a little far north for you, but since I lived on more closer to San Carlos, San Mateo, that area, Cañada Road.
84, yep.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Yeah.
All right, good. Well, how can people get in touch with you at Enstall?
Best on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Actually, Corey Geiger. My handle, I think it's Corey Geiger.
CoreyGeiger. Is there a dot between?
No, sir.
All right. And what about the URL for IronRidge and or Enstall?
So Enstall has a website that covers all of our activities globally. That's enstall.com, ENSTALL.com. And then PanelClaw, EcoFasten, and IronRidge all have websites. EcoFastens happens to be EcoFastenSolar.com, and then PanelClaw.com and IronRidge.com.
All right, that's great. All right, well, that's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. Thanks, Corey, for joining us, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you missed any of today's show, you can always go to our website at www.energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.